August 9th, 1945. The island of Okinawa still smoldered with the ash of conquest. American Marines patrolled streets where civilians hid in caves, starving, terrified, convinced that surrender meant torture and death. But on this day, one corporal would face a choice no training manual had prepared him for: obey orders to seal the caves, or risk everything to save 1,500 enemy souls who believed he was their executioner. This is not a story about victory. This is a story about one man's defiance of war itself. If you love untold stories of courage that transcend the battlefield, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and watch until the end. Because what happened in those caves would challenge everything the world thought it knew about enemies, humanity, and the true cost of compassion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. April 1st, 1945. Dawn broke over the Pacific with a violence that seemed to split the sky itself. Operation Iceberg had begun. The invasion of Okinawa, the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War, would claim over 200,000 lives before it ended. But the battles fought with bullets and bombs were only half the story. The other half played out in darkness, in the limestone caves that honeycombed the island like a labyrinth of despair. Corporal Daniel Hartley of the 6th Marine Division had landed on the beaches with the first wave. The sand beneath his boots was not white, but gray with volcanic ash. The smell hit him immediately. Cordite, burned vegetation, and something else he couldn't name then but would never forget: the scent of an island dying. Around him, landing craft vomited men and machines onto shores that erupted with artillery fire. The thunder was not metaphorical. It was physical, a percussion that hammered his chest and made his teeth ache. But the court-martial never came. Instead, word spread. By nightfall, Hartley's platoon had cleared 4 more caves using his method. By the end of the week, the entire division had adopted new protocols. Interpreters were brought forward. Food and water were offered at cave entrances. Surrender leaflets, printed in Japanese, were distributed by the thousands. And the civilians came out. Hundreds, then thousands. By the time Okinawa was declared secure in late June, over 1,500 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians had surrendered to Hartley's platoon alone, drawn out not by threats or explosives, but by the simple, radical act of one man choosing mercy over orders. The paradox was cruel and beautiful. In a war defined by brutality, where both sides committed atrocities in the name of victory, where the firebombings of Tokyo and the horrors of Nanking had hardened hearts into stone, one corporal had found a way to fight without killing. He had weaponized compassion. But the story was not over. Because what Hartley did not know, as he sat in a muddy foxhole that night, eating cold rations and trying not to think about how close he had come to being buried alive, was that his actions had set off a chain reaction. Japanese commanders, monitoring American radio chatter, heard reports of Marines offering mercy. Civilians, whispering in the darkness of their caves, passed the word that the demons were not demons after all. And slowly, impossibly, the psychology of the battlefield began to shift. The island of ghosts was learning that some ghosts could be saved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words were clumsy, badly pronounced, but the meaning was clear. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the soldiers raised his rifle, his hands trembling so badly the barrel wavered like a branch in wind. An old woman pushed the barrel down, speaking rapidly in a dialect Hartley couldn't follow. She stepped forward, her face a map of deep lines and deeper sorrow. She spoke, and though Hartley understood perhaps one word in 10, he grasped the essence. They had been here for 6 days. The Japanese soldiers had told them the Americans would kill them, would defile their women, would bayonet their children. They had chosen death by starvation over death by torture. But now, staring at this young Marine with dirt on his face and fear in his eyes, the old woman asked a question that transcended language. "Hontou desu ka? Is it true?" Hartley nodded. "Hontou desu. Anzen desu. It is true. You are safe." Outside, Kowalski checked his watch. 2 minutes had passed. He looked at Ramirez, at the demo team standing ready with their satchel charges. He opened his mouth to give the order. Then Hartley emerged from the cave. Behind him, moving slowly, came the old woman. Behind her, a child. Then another woman. Then a soldier, his rifle left behind in the darkness, his hands raised above his head. And then more. A river of humanity flowing from the earth, blinking in the harsh sunlight, their faces streaked with tears and cave dust. They kept coming. 20, 50, 100. The Marines stared, their weapons lowering, their faces cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been shame. The civilians collapsed on the ground outside the cave, some praying, some weeping, some simply staring at the sky as if seeing it for the first time. The soldiers were separated and searched. They were malnourished, dehydrated, some wounded, but they were alive. The civilians were counted by a stunned corpsman. 143 souls pulled from one cave. Kowalski approached Hartley, his face unreadable. He stood so close that Hartley could see the stubble on his jaw and the red veins in his eyes from too many sleepless nights. "Corporal," Kowalski said quietly, "you just saved more lives than most men kill in this entire war." Hartley didn't feel like a hero. He felt exhausted. His hands shook. His knees wanted to buckle. But he looked at the old woman who had trusted him, who was now holding a child and speaking softly to calm the boy's sobs, and he knew that whatever happened next, this moment was worth the court-martial he expected.
Hartley stood. His legs shook, but his voice did not. "Then I'm disobeying those orders, sir." The air crystallized. Disobeying orders in a combat zone was a court-martial offense. In some cases, it was a firing squad offense. Every man knew it. Kowalski's hand moved to the pistol on his hip, not drawing it, but resting there in a gesture that spoke volumes. "Corporal Hartley," Kowalski said slowly, "you will stand down or I will have you arrested." Hartley met his eyes. "Arrest me after I try, sir, but I'm going in." What happened next would be debated in after-action reports and officer candidate school ethics classes for decades. Kowalski could have stopped him, should have stopped him, but perhaps something in the lieutenant's own conscience, something he would never speak aloud, made him hesitate. He looked at Hartley for 5 long seconds, then stepped aside. 2 minutes, Kowalski said, then we seal it with or without you inside. Hartley handed his rifle to Chen, pulled his flashlight from his belt, and approached the cave mouth. The darkness was absolute, a physical thing that seemed to swallow light. He clicked on the flashlight, and the beam cut through the black, revealing walls slick with moisture and a tunnel that descended at a steep angle into the earth. He stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was cooler, damp, and carried the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and something else, blood, old and metallic. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to crouch, then crawl. His flashlight beam bounced off limestone formations that looked like teeth, like the throat of some enormous beast swallowing him whole. Then he heard them. Breathing. Dozens of people, maybe more, their breaths synchronized in the rhythm of collective terror. He swept the flashlight forward, and the beam found faces. They were huddled in a natural chamber about 20 feet across, packed so tightly that bodies pressed against bodies. Women clutching infants, old men with faces carved by decades of sun and labor, children, some no older than 5, staring at him with eyes that reflected his flashlight like animals caught in headlights, and soldiers, young men in tattered Imperial Army uniforms, rifles clutched in shaking hands, their faces pale with exhaustion and starvation. For a frozen moment, no one moved. Hartley's hand was on his pistol, but he did not draw it. Instead, he did something that every instinct and every hour of training told him was insane. He raised his hands, palms out, and spoke in the halting Japanese he had learned from the phrasebook and from listening to interpreters. Watashi wa, anata wo, tasuketai. I want to help you.
Ramirez pulled a Japanese phrasebook from his pocket, a battered pamphlet printed by military intelligence that promised to teach Marines useful phrases like surrender or die and where are the officers. His Japanese was atrocious, mangled by a Texan drawl that turned every syllable into something unrecognizable. But he shouted into the darkness anyway. Ditekait kudasai. Come out, please come out. Silence answered. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of held breath. Hartley, crouched 10 feet away with his M1 Garand aimed at the cave mouth, could feel it. They were in there, listening, terrified. Ramirez tried again, his voice cracking with the strain. Anata wa korosaremasen, anata wa anzen des. You will not be killed. You are safe. A sound came from the cave. Not words, but weeping. High-pitched, broken, unmistakably the sound of children crying. Jesus, Chen whispered beside Hartley. There's kids in there. Kowalski's jaw worked. He looked at the cave, at his men, at the map folded in his hand. Then he looked at his watch. 5 minutes. If they don't come out, we seal it. Hartley's pulse hammered in his ears. 5 minutes. He stared at the cave entrance, willing someone to emerge, to make this simple. But the only sound was weeping, and beneath it, the low murmur of adult voices speaking Japanese too fast and too frightened for his limited understanding. The minutes crawled. 3, 4. Kowalski raised his hand, signaling for the demolition team to move forward. 2 engineers, faces blank with the practiced numbness of men who had done this before, approached with satchel charges. Canvas bags packed with 20 pounds of TNT and a fuse that burned for 30 seconds. "Wait," Hartley said. The word came out before he could stop it. Kowalski turned, his eyes cold. "Corporal?" "Sir, request permission to go in." The silence that followed was absolute. 30 men stared at Hartley like he had suggested flying to the moon. "Denied," Kowalski said flatly. "We don't know what's in there. Could be 100 soldiers waiting to gut you." "Could be 100 civilians waiting to starve," Hartley shot back. "Sir, we can't just bury them." "We can and we will. Those are our orders." By mid-April, the Marines had pushed inland, but the fighting had not ended. It had simply gone underground. Japanese forces, following orders to resist to the last man, retreated into the cave systems, and with them went something unexpected: civilians. Thousands of Okinawan men, women, and children, taught by Japanese propaganda that American soldiers were demons who would rape, torture, and murder anyone they captured, fled into the darkness rather than face surrender. Hartley's platoon was assigned to cave-clearing operations in the village of Shuri, a sector so contested that maps were redrawn daily. The morning of April 18th began with a briefing that felt more like a funeral. Lieutenant Raymond Kowalski, a Polish immigrant from Chicago, whose voice still carried the flat vowels of the stockyards, stood before 30 exhausted men and laid out the mission with bureaucratic precision. Intelligence reports estimate 500 to 800 enemy combatants in the cave network beneath this ridge, Kowalski said, tapping a crude map with his knuckle. Civilians are present, number unknown. Your orders are to offer surrender. If refused, you are authorized to use grenades, flamethrowers, or demolition charges to seal the entrances. The words hung in the humid air. Seal the entrances. Every man understood what that meant. It meant burying people alive. It meant that the distinction between soldier and civilian would be erased in rubble and suffocation. Private Tommy Chen, a San Francisco native who had lied about his age to enlist at 17, raised his hand. "Sir, what if they don't come out, but we can hear them? Women and kids." Kowalski's face was stone. "Your orders stand. We cannot afford to leave enemy positions active in our rear. This is war, Private, not Sunday school." Hartley said nothing. He had learned months ago that silence was the only safe response to orders that twisted your stomach. But inside, something tightened. He thought of his sister back in Oregon, teaching second grade. He thought of the school children who waved at him from the train when he shipped out. He thought of what it meant to seal a cave with children inside. The platoon moved out at 0600 hours, climbing a ridge slick with morning dew and blood from the previous day's fighting. The terrain was vertical, jagged limestone that cut through gloves and tore at uniforms. The trees that remained were charred stalks, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward a sky choked with smoke. The smell of death was everywhere, thick and sweet, and impossible to escape. They reached the first cave entrance at 0730 hours. It was small, barely 4 feet high, hidden behind a tangle of vines and shattered stone. Kowalski positioned men on either side and called forward Sergeant Luis Ramirez, a Texan whose grandfather had fought at the Alamo and who carried that legacy like a second skin. "Call them out," Kowalski ordered. The morning after Hartley's first cave rescue, the 6th Marine Division woke to a new kind of warfare. Orders came down from Colonel Edwin Jenkins, a Georgian native whose drawl had been hardened by 3 amphibious campaigns, that cave-clearing protocols were to be modified immediately. Demolition charges were now a last resort. Interpreters were to be positioned at every suspected civilian shelter. Food, water, and medical supplies were to be offered before any hostile action. The change was not met with universal approval. In the command tent erected on a muddy plateau overlooking the Shuri defensive line, Captain Harold Brennan slammed his fist on a field table hard enough to make the maps jump. Brennan was a West Point graduate, class of 1940, whose by-the-book mentality had earned him respect and resentment in equal measure. "This is a combat zone, not a charity ward," Brennan said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Every hour we spend coaxing civilians out of caves is an hour the Japanese use to regroup, resupply, and fortify." Colonel Jenkins, who sat in a canvas chair that sagged under his weight, did not look up from the report he was reading. It was a casualty list from the previous day's fighting. 37 Marines killed, 82 wounded. The numbers blurred together after weeks of this grinding arithmetic of death. "Captain," Jenkins said quietly, "how many of those casualties do you think came from civilians throwing grenades?" Brennan hesitated. "Sir, intelligence estimates." "Intelligence estimates jack shit," Jenkins interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with the purple bruises of sleeplessness. "I've been reading after-action reports. Half the enemy combatants we're killing are women and children who think we're going to eat them alive. We're creating the resistance we're fighting." The tent fell silent. Outside, the rain began again, that endless Pacific rain that turned everything into soup. It drummed on the canvas roof with a sound like distant machine gun fire. "Sir," Brennan said, choosing his words carefully, "with respect, Corporal Hartley's actions yesterday were heroic but reckless. We cannot base division-wide strategy on one lucky incident." "It wasn't luck," said a new voice. Major Theodore Walsh entered the tent, shaking rain from his poncho. Walsh was the division's intelligence officer, a former college professor from Boston whose wire-rimmed glasses gave him the look of a scholar rather than a soldier. He carried a folder thick with typed pages. "I've been analyzing Japanese radio intercepts from the past 12 hours. They're talking about Hartley." Jenkins sat forward. "Explain." Walsh opened the folder and pulled out several sheets covered in Japanese characters and rough English translations. "The Japanese have spotters watching our positions. They saw what happened yesterday. More importantly, they heard the civilians talking when we moved them to the refugee camps.
The word is spreading through the cave networks. There's a Marine who doesn't kill, a Marine who brings people out alive. So, said Brennan, that makes him a propaganda target. No, said Walsh, and there was something like wonder in his voice. It makes him a weapon. The Japanese command structure is terrified of this. They've built their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that Okinawan civilians would rather die than surrender. But if civilians start believing they'll be treated humanely, the whole psychological foundation collapses. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously. You're saying Hartley's compassion is a military asset?
I'm saying it's the most effective weapon we've deployed since the flamethrower, Walsh replied, and the Japanese know it. They're already issuing orders to execute any civilian who talks about surrendering. The weight of that statement settled over the tent like a fog. Outside, someone shouted orders. A truck engine coughed to life. The ordinary sounds of war continued, indifferent to the conversation that was reshaping how that war would be fought. All right, Jenkins said finally. Walsh, you coordinate with interpreters. I want surrender appeals broadcast on loudspeakers at every major cave network. Brennan, your company will continue cave operations, but you'll do it Hartley's way. No charges unless you receive direct enemy fire. Brennan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yes, sir. And Walsh, Jenkins added, find Corporal Hartley. I want him on the next operation. Apparently, he's got a knack for this. By mid-morning, Hartley found himself sitting in a jeep beside Walsh, bouncing along a road that was more crater than pavement. They were headed to a valley called Kakazu, where intelligence suggested a network of caves sheltered several hundred civilians and an unknown number of Japanese soldiers. Walsh briefed him as they drove, shouting over the engine noise. The locals called these caves the Tombs of 10,000. They've been used for burial rituals for centuries. The Japanese turned them into bunkers. Civilians fled there when the fighting started. How many? Hartley asked. Best guess? 300 to 500, maybe more. Hartley felt his stomach knot. Yesterday's cave had been 143 people, and that had nearly overwhelmed him. 300 was incomprehensible. They reached the valley by noon. It was a natural amphitheater carved into limestone, its walls pocked with cave entrances, like eyes staring down at the Marines who set up positions around the perimeter. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and steaming in the sudden appearance of sun. The smell was overpowering. Rotting vegetation, human waste from the Marines' field latrines, and the ever-present stench of death that seemed to seep from the very ground. Lieutenant Kowalski was already there, along with 2 interpreters. One was a Nisei soldier named Private James Nakamura, whose parents had been interned in California while their son fought for America. The other was an Okinawan man named Takeshi Yamamoto, a civilian caught between 2 armies, who had chosen to help the Americans in exchange for protection for his family.
Corporal? Kowalski greeted Hartley with something that might have been respect. Glad you're here. We've been calling into the caves for an hour. Nothing but silence. Hartley surveyed the valley. A dozen cave entrances were visible from where he stood, and Walsh's briefing suggested twice that many hidden by vegetation or rockfall. The limestone cliffs rose 100 feet, sheer and unclimbable. It was a natural fortress, and anyone inside could hold out indefinitely if they had water and supplies. What about the leaflets? Hartley asked. Nakamura held up a stack of papers. They were printed in Japanese, illustrated with crude drawings showing American soldiers giving food to civilians, treating wounded children, families reunited in safety. The message was simple: surrender and live, resist and die. We've been dropping them from the ridge, Nakamura said, but we don't know if anyone's reading them. Hartley took one of the leaflets and studied it. The Japanese characters meant nothing to him, but the drawings were clear enough. A mother holding a child, a soldier with a medical kit, simple humanity rendered in black ink. Let me try something, Hartley said. He walked to the largest cave entrance, his boots squelching in mud.
The opening was wide, perhaps 10 feet across, with a natural overhang that would provide shelter from rain and aerial bombing. He could see the darkness inside, that absolute black that swallowed light and hope alike. He didn't shout. Instead, he sat down at the cave entrance, cross-legged, his rifle laid on the ground beside him. Then he pulled out his canteen and took a long drink. The water was warm, metallic from the canteen's lining, but he made a show of drinking deeply and sighing with satisfaction. Behind him, Marines watched in confusion. Kowalski opened his mouth to speak, but Walsh raised a hand to stop him. Hartley set the canteen down in front of him, clearly visible to anyone watching from the cave. Then he pulled out a ration tin, processed cheese and crackers, the kind that Marines joked could survive a nuclear blast, and opened it with his P-38 can opener. The small metallic clicks echoed in the valley's acoustic bowl. He ate slowly, deliberately, making no threatening moves, just a man having lunch. 5 minutes passed, 10. The sun climbed higher, turning the valley into a steam bath. Sweat ran down Hartley's back, his legs cramped from sitting still. But he didn't move. Then he heard it. Breathing. Close. Just inside the cave entrance, hidden in shadow. Someone was watching him. "Konnichiwa," Hartley said softly. "Hello." He kept his eyes on his food, not looking at the cave. "Watashi no namae wa Hartley desu." My name is Hartley. No response, but the breathing didn't retreat. Hartley took another cracker, chewed it slowly. "Onaka ga suite masu ka? Are you hungry?" A long silence, then, barely audible, a child's voice. "Hi. Yes." Hartley's heart hammered. He reached slowly for his ration tin and pushed it forward, toward the cave. "Dozo, please." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small hand, no bigger than his sister's student's hands back in Oregon, reached out of the darkness and snatched the tin. The hand disappeared. He heard the sound of eating, desperate and fast. "Moto arimasu," he said. "There is more." He pulled another ration from his pack and set it down. "Taksan."
This time, the hand came out more slowly, and with it, a face. A girl, perhaps 6 years old, her hair matted with dirt, her face so thin that her skull seemed visible beneath the skin. Her eyes were enormous, dark pools that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. She took the ration, stared at Hartley. He smiled at her, the most unthreatening smile he could manage, and nodded toward the food. "Tabete," he said. "Eat." She backed into the darkness but didn't flee. And then, behind her, more faces appeared. Women, old men, children clutching younger children. They emerged slowly, like creatures from a fairy tale, blinking in the sunlight that must have seemed as alien to them as the surface of the moon. Hartley stood slowly, hands visible, palms out. "Anzen desu," he said, his voice carrying across the valley. "You are safe." The first woman stepped fully into the light. She was young, perhaps 20, carrying an infant who looked more dead than alive, its skin gray and its breathing shallow. She looked at Hartley, at the Marines positioned around the valley, at the weapons pointed everywhere and nowhere. "Tasukete kudasai," she whispered. "Please, help." Hartley turned and shouted to the Marines, "Corpsman, get a corpsman over here now." Private Eddie Sullivan, a medic from Philadelphia, whose hands were steadier than a surgeon's, sprinted across the valley with his medical bag bouncing against his hip. He reached the woman, assessed the infant with a single practiced glance, and immediately began treatment. Dehydration, malnutrition, probably dysentery. He set up an IV line using a tree branch as a stand, inserted the needle with gentle precision, and the glucose solution began dripping into the baby's arm.
The woman collapsed to her knees, not in surrender, but in relief so profound it looked like prayer. She bent over the infant, tears streaming down her face, whispering words Hartley didn't need translated. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And then, as if a dam had broken, they came. From the caves, from the darkness, from the places where they had been waiting to die. Civilians emerged by the dozens, then by the hundred. Old women supporting men whose legs could no longer carry them. Teenagers carrying children too weak to walk. They came slowly, fearfully, but they came. The Marines moved into action with the efficiency of men trained for chaos. Corpsmen set up a triage station. Cooks hauled up field kitchens and began boiling water for soup. Engineers cleared areas for temporary shelters. And through it all, Hartley moved among the civilians, speaking his broken Japanese, offering water, guiding the elderly to sitting positions, taking children by the hand and walking them to the medical tents.
By mid-afternoon, the valley looked like a different world. Where there had been only silence and death, there was now the sound of crying children. Not the crying of terror, but of exhaustion and relief. Women spoke in low voices, their words tumbling over each other in the linguistic chaos of trauma survived. Old men sat in the sun and wept openly, their tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on their faces. Nakamura approached Hartley, his expression unreadable. "Corporal, you should see this." He led Hartley to a group of Japanese soldiers. There were 15 of them, sitting in a circle, their rifles stacked in a neat pile under Marine guard. They were young, some looking barely old enough to shave. Their uniforms hung on skeletal frames. One had a bandage around his head, brown with dried blood. Another was missing his left hand, the stump wrapped in cloth that had once been white. "They want to talk to you," Nakamura said. Hartley approached slowly. One of the soldiers stood, a sergeant, judging by the insignia on his collar. He bowed deeply, a formal gesture that seemed absurd in the mud and chaos of the valley. Nakamura translated as the sergeant spoke. "He says his name is Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka. He's been in these caves for 3 weeks with his men and the civilians. He says they were ordered to fight to the death, to kill any civilian who tried to surrender, to turn the caves into a tomb for everyone rather than let Americans take prisoners." Hartley said nothing, just listened. "But yesterday," Nakamura continued, "he heard something on a captured American radio, a broadcast about a Marine who saved civilians, who brought them out alive. He says he didn't believe it. He thought it was American propaganda. But then today, when you sat at the cave entrance and gave food to the child, he realized it was true." Tanaka spoke again, his voice breaking. Nakamura's translation came slowly. "He says he's sorry. He says he's been fighting in China, in the Philippines, here on Okinawa. He says he's seen what war does to people, what it did to him. But watching you with the child, he remembered who he was before the war. He says he couldn't let the children die in the darkness. He says you gave him permission to be human again." The silence that followed was profound. Hartley looked at this man who, in another context, would have killed him without hesitation. This man who probably killed American soldiers. This man who is now thanking him for showing mercy to civilians. "Tell him that I'm just trying to get everyone home alive," Hartley said slowly. Nakamura translated. Tanaka bowed again, deeper this time. Then he said something else, and Nakamura's eyes widened. "What?" Hartley asked. "He says there are more caves, at least 6 other locations in this sector. He says he'll show you where they are. He'll help you bring the civilians out." Hartley felt something shift in his chest. He extended his hand to Tanaka. The Japanese sergeant stared at it for a moment, this gesture from a foreign culture, then reached out and shook it. His grip was weak from malnutrition, but his eyes held something that transcended the language barrier, the uniforms, the war itself. Hope. Over the next 3 weeks, Hartley and Tanaka became an improbable team. With Nakamura translating, they moved from cave to cave, valley to valley, across the blood-soaked landscape of southern Okinawa. Tanaka knew the terrain, knew the people, knew what words to say in the darkest to coax frightened civilians into the light. And Hartley provided what Tanaka could not: the uniform and face of the enemy, transformed into a promise of safety. The numbers grew. 200 civilians from a cave network near Naha, 300 from the tombs at Itaman, 50 from a sea cave accessible only at low tide, where families had been trapped for days by the rising water. Each group emerged with the same expressions: disbelief, terror gradually giving way to cautious hope, and finally, relief so intense it looked like madness. Not every attempt succeeded. At a cave near the village of Mabuni, Hartley sat for 6 hours, calling into the darkness, offering food and water, promising safety. No one came out. Finally, engineers pumped smoke into the cave to force movement. When they entered later, they found 73 bodies, civilians and soldiers alike, dead by their own hands rather than face capture. Poison, hangings, grenade blasts that had torn families apart in final, desperate moments. Hartley vomited in the bushes afterward, his body rejecting not just the sight, but the implications. Walsh found him there and sat beside him in the mud. "You can't save them all," Walsh said quietly. "I should have tried harder," Hartley replied. "You did everything possible. Some won't believe, some can't believe. The propaganda runs too deep." But Hartley couldn't shake the image of those bodies. A mother and daughter, arms wrapped around each other. An old man sitting peacefully, a cup of poisoned tea beside him. Children who would never grow old, never learn that the monsters they feared had been myths. That night, back at the division camp, Hartley sat alone in his tent and wrote a letter to his sister. He didn't mention the deaths. Instead, he told her about the little girl who had taken his ration, who was now in a refugee camp with her family, who had smiled at him yesterday when he brought her chocolate from a care package. He told her about Sergeant Tanaka, who had chosen humanity over orders. He told her that war was teaching him things the world had never prepared him for. "I thought courage meant charging into enemy fire," he wrote by the light of a kerosene lamp that filled the tent with oily smoke. "But sometimes courage means sitting still. Sometimes it means offering food to someone who might kill you. Sometimes it means believing that people are more than what the war makes them." He sealed the letter and addressed it to Willamette Valley, Oregon. He knew she might not receive it for weeks. He knew he might not be alive when she read it. But he needed to write it. Needed to put words to what was happening to him in these caves, in these valleys, in these impossible moments where enemy and savior became meaningless words. By late May, the statistics had become impossible to ignore. Hartley's methods, adopted by other units and platoons across the division, had resulted in the surrender of over 1,500 civilians and soldiers. More remarkably, Marine casualties in cave-clearing operations had dropped by 40%. Fewer ambushes, fewer booby traps, fewer grenades thrown from darkness. The paradox was complete. By showing mercy, Hartley had made the battlefield safer for his own men. By refusing to kill, he had saved American lives. But the cost was measured in more than numbers. Every night, Hartley dreamed of caves. Sometimes he dreamed of the ones where he had succeeded, where faces emerged from darkness into light. More often, he dreamed of Mabuni, of the 73 bodies, of the mother and daughter who had died believing he was a demon. He woke each morning exhausted, haunted, and determined to try again. Because somewhere in the limestone darkness of Okinawa, more people waited, more families huddled in terror, more children whispered questions their parents couldn't answer. And if he could reach even one more, if he could coax even one more group into the light, then the nightmares were worth it. The war had taught Daniel Hartley to kill, but these caves were teaching him something the Marine Corps manual had never mentioned: how to live with what he chose not to do. June 21, 1945. The rain had returned to Okinawa with a vengeance, transforming the island into a gray waterscape where sky and earth blended into indistinguishable sheets of falling water. The Battle of Okinawa was declared officially over. Japanese organized resistance had collapsed. But in the limestone caves scattered across the southern peninsula, thousands still hid, believing that surrender meant death, that the propaganda they had been fed for years was truth rather than tactical deception. Corporal Daniel Hartley stood at the entrance to what intelligence had designated as Cave Complex Zebra 7, watching rain cascade off the brim of his helmet in a continuous curtain. Behind him, a full platoon waited in the downpour. 36 men who had learned his methods, who had seen what patience and compassion could accomplish where grenades and flamethrowers had failed. Beside him stood Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, now officially a prisoner of war, but functioning as an interpreter and mediator, his presence a bridge between two worlds that had been trying to destroy each other for 4 years. This cave system was different from the others. Intelligence reports, pieced together from surrendered soldiers and aerial reconnaissance, suggested that somewhere in the network's depths, a Japanese colonel had established a final command post. Colonel Yahiko Matsumoto was a career officer, a veteran of the Manchurian campaigns and the Philippines, a man who had reportedly told his subordinates that he would rather die than dishonor himself through surrender. With him were an estimated 200 soldiers and, tragically, nearly 400 civilians who had been either prevented from leaving or were too terrified to attempt escape. "This one will be different," Tanaka said quietly in English. His language skills had improved dramatically over the past month, fed by constant interaction with Americans and a linguistic aptitude that suggested he had once been a student or teacher before the war. Matsumoto is old guard, samurai mentality. He believes death is preferable to defeat. "Then we'll have to change his mind," Hartley replied, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. The past weeks had taught him that belief was the strongest armor, harder to penetrate than steel or concrete. Some people could not be saved, because they had made peace with death, had chosen it, had elevated it to something sacred. Major Walsh approached through the rain, his poncho streaming water. He had been promoted after the cave operations proved successful, given command of the division's Civil Affairs Unit with the specific mandate to maximize civilian surrenders while minimizing American casualties. The irony was not lost on anyone. A college professor from Boston now commanded operations based on the improvised methods of a corporal from Oregon.
"Hartley? Tanaka," Walsh greeted them. "We've got a problem. Radio intercepts suggest Matsumoto has ordered his men to kill any civilian who attempts to leave the caves. He's treating them as hostages, insurance against assault." Hartley felt his stomach tighten. "How reliable is the intelligence?" "Very. We captured 2 soldiers from this complex yesterday. They confirmed it. Matsumoto has positioned guards at every major tunnel intersection. Any civilian who tries to reach the exits will be shot as a deserter." The rain drummed on helmets, on ponchos, on the limestone that formed the bones of this island. Somewhere in the darkness below, 400 people waited, trapped, not just by geography, but by the will of one man who had decided their fate. "We need to talk to him," Hartley said, "directly, not through interpreters shouting into caves, face to face." Walsh stared at him. "You want to walk into a cave system controlled by a Japanese colonel who has explicitly ordered his men to fight to the death? That's suicide." "It's also the only way this ends without mass casualties," Hartley countered. "If we assault, civilians die. If we seal the caves, everyone dies. If we wait them out, people starve. But if I can reach Matsumoto, if I can talk to him as one soldier to another, maybe we can find a different ending." "And if he shoots you the moment you walk in?" Hartley looked at Tanaka. That's why he's coming with me. Tanaka knows the military protocols, the respect hierarchy. He can make the initial contact, arrange a parley. Tanaka's face was unreadable. Colonel Matsumoto would view me as a traitor. My cooperation with Americans is, in his eyes, the ultimate dishonor. He might kill me simply for requesting an audience. Will you try anyway? The silence stretched. Rain continued its endless percussion. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fired. Smaller now, cleanup operations, rather than the massive barrages that had characterized the battle's earlier phases. The war was ending, everyone could feel it, but endings could be as violent as beginnings if no one chose a different path. Yes, Tanaka said finally, I will try, because those civilians deserve a choice, even if Matsumoto has taken it from them. Within an hour, a plan had been constructed. Tanaka would enter the cave system under a white flag, actually a pillowcase from a medical supply kit tied to a length of bamboo. He would request a formal meeting with Colonel Matsumoto, invoking military courtesy protocols that theoretically transcended the chaos of the battlefield. If Matsumoto agreed, Hartley would enter for negotiations. If Matsumoto refused, or if Tanaka was killed, the Marines would have no choice but to assault. The wait was excruciating. Tanaka disappeared into the cave entrance at 1300 hours, the white flag held high, his figure swallowed by darkness within seconds. Hartley sat outside, his rifle across his knees, water dripping from every surface, counting minutes that felt like hours. Around him, Marines took positions, checking weapons, speaking in low voices about everything except what they were all thinking, that Tanaka was probably already dead, that this entire mission was futile, that some battles could only end one way.
2 hours passed, then 3. Walsh paced like a caged animal, his boots carving furrows in the mud. Kowalski chain-smoked cigarettes that went out in the rain, relighting them with increasing frustration. The platoon medic, Sullivan, organized his supplies for the 5th time, a nervous ritual that kept his hands busy. At 16:27 hours, movement in the cave. Everyone tensed, weapons raised. But it was Tanaka who emerged, and he was alive. Barely. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. Blood ran from his nose, mixing with rain on his chin. He walked slowly, deliberately, like a man who had faced death and been granted temporary reprieve. "He'll see you," Tanaka said to Hartley, his voice thick from what might have been a broken jaw. "But only you. No weapons. No tricks. He says if you violate his terms, he'll execute 10 civilians for every breach of protocol." Walsh started to protest. "This is insane. We can't send an unarmed Marine into—" "I'm going," Hartley interrupted. He stood, began removing his gear. Helmet, rifle, pistol, knife, ammunition belt. Each piece of equipment felt like he was shedding armor, leaving himself vulnerable to a world that had proven repeatedly it would kill him given the chance. When he was finished, he stood in just his combat utilities, soaked through, weaponless, as close to civilian as a Marine could get while still wearing the uniform. "If I'm not out in 2 hours," Hartley said to Walsh, "do whatever you think is right." He didn't wait for a response. He picked up the white flag Tanaka had carried and walked into the cave. The transition from light to dark was absolute. The rain's sound faded, replaced by the drip of water from limestone formations and the echo of his own breathing. His boots splashed through puddles that couldn't be seen, only felt. The temperature dropped immediately, from tropical humidity to something cold and clammy that raised goosebumps on his arms. He followed a tunnel that descended at a steep angle, using one hand against the wall for guidance while holding the white flag ahead of him. The limestone was wet, slippery, covered with what felt like moss or algae. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself on formations that jutted from the walls like bones. Then he saw light ahead. Not daylight, but the flickering orange of lanterns or torches.
Voices carried from that direction, speaking Japanese in tones he couldn't decipher, but could feel. Tension, anticipation, fear. He rounded a corner and entered a chamber. It was enormous, perhaps 50 feet across and 30 high, a natural cathedral carved by water over millennia. Lanterns hung from stakes driven into cracks in the rock, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem alive. And in that chamber were the people intelligence had estimated, hundreds of them, civilians and soldiers mixed together in a way that made distinction meaningless. Children sat listlessly, too exhausted or malnourished to cry. Women huddled in groups, their faces hollowed by weeks of insufficient food and constant fear. Old men leaned against the walls, their eyes vacant, already more ghost than flesh. And among them, Japanese soldiers, young men and old, some wounded, bandages dark with blood, others watching Hartley with expressions ranging from curiosity to hatred. At the far end of the chamber, on a natural platform of raised stone, sat Colonel Yahiko Matsumoto. He was smaller than Hartley had expected, perhaps 5'6", his uniform immaculate despite the conditions, his sword, an actual katana, resting across his knees. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of deep creases that came from decades of command and the weight of decisions that sent men to their deaths. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, missing nothing as Hartley approached and stopped 15 feet away. Hartley bowed. It was awkward, unpracticed, probably wrong by every formal standard. But it was an attempt at respect, at acknowledgement that this man, however wrong his choices, still deserved to be treated as a human being rather than an enemy to be destroyed. Matsumoto spoke. His Japanese was formal, archaic even, the language of imperial courts and military tradition. An interpreter, a young lieutenant who stood beside the colonel, translated into English that was surprisingly fluent. Colonel Matsumoto acknowledges your courage in entering his sanctuary unarmed. He asks what message you bring that could not be shouted from safety outside. Hartley took a breath. This was it. Everything depended on what he said next, how he said it, whether he could find words that bridged the vast gulf between their worlds. I bring no message from my commanders, Hartley said slowly, giving the interpreter time to translate. I come as one soldier speaking to another. I've spent the past month in caves like this one, talking to people who believed Americans were monsters. I've watched mothers realize their children might live. I've seen soldiers choose life over death. And I've learned that war makes us all into things we never wanted to be. Matsumoto listened, his face expressionless. When the translation finished, he responded, and the interpreter's voice carried his words. War does not make us into things. War reveals what we always were. I am a soldier of the Emperor. My duty is clear. I will die in service to that duty, and those under my command will share that honor. What about the civilians? Hartley gestured to the people filling the chamber. They're not soldiers. They have no duty to die for military honor. They're farmers, shopkeepers, grandparents, children. They just want to go home.
There is no home to return to, Matsumoto said through the interpreter. The Americans have destroyed everything. Better to die with dignity than live as slaves to the enemy. Hartley felt frustration rising, but forced it down. Anger would accomplish nothing here. I'm not your enemy. I'm a corporal from Oregon who wants to finish this war and go home to his sister who teaches second grade. You're a colonel from... He paused, realizing he knew nothing about this man's life before the uniform, before the sword, before the cave. Kyoto, the interpreter supplied softly, perhaps going beyond his role but sensing something important in the exchange. The colonel is from Kyoto.
He taught military history at the academy before the war. Hartley seized on this. Then you know history. You know that every war ends, every battle concludes, and when they do, the survivors have to build something from the ruins. These people, he gestured again at the civilians, they're the ones who'll do that building, but only if they're alive. Matsumoto was silent for a long moment. His hand rested on the sword across his knees, fingers tracing the decorated scabbard in what might have been unconscious gesture. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, and the interpreter's translation carried something new. Doubt. You ask me to abandon everything I have believed, everything I have taught. The code of Bushido does not permit surrender. It does not permit the dishonor of capture. I'm not asking you to surrender, Hartley said, the words coming faster now as he sensed an opening. I'm asking you to let the civilians go. Keep your soldiers, keep your position, keep your honor, but release the people who never asked to be part of this. Let them choose their own path. If I release them, your forces will use their departure to launch an assault. I give you my word that won't happen. I'll stay here, in this chamber, until every civilian who wants to leave has done so. I'll be your hostage, your guarantee. If my commanders attack while people are evacuating, I die with everyone else. The silence that followed was profound. Every person in the chamber seemed to hold their breath. Matsumoto stared at Hartley with an intensity that felt physical, as if he could see through flesh to whatever truth lay beneath. Why would you do this? Matsumoto asked. What do these people mean to you? Hartley thought about that question. He thought about the little girl who had taken his ration, about Tanaka's transformation from enemy to ally, about the 73 bodies at Mabuni that haunted his sleep, about his sister back in Oregon and the world he wanted to return to, a world where children could grow up without caves and fear and the weight of old men's honor crushing them.
They mean everything, Hartley said simply. Because if I can't save them, then what was this war for? What did we fight for if not the idea that every life matters, that people deserve the chance to choose their own future? You can kill me right now, Colonel, but it won't change the truth. This war is over. You've lost. But you can still choose what that loss means. You can choose whether it ends in death or in the possibility that something better comes after. Matsumoto closed his eyes. For a moment, Hartley thought he had failed, that the colonel would order his death and the deaths of everyone in the chamber. But when Matsumoto opened his eyes again, something had changed. The hardness was still there, but beneath it, Hartley saw something else. Exhaustion. Grief. The terrible weight of command that had finally become too heavy to bear. I will allow the civilians to leave, Matsumoto said through the interpreter. But understand this, American. I am still an officer of the Imperial Army. I will not surrender. When the civilians are safe, my soldiers and I will die as warriors. That is the only honor left to us. I understand, Hartley said, though his heart ached at the waste of it. But he had learned over the past weeks that you couldn't save everyone, couldn't change every mind. You saved who you could and lived with the knowledge that others would make different choices. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Matsumoto stood, his sword still in hand, and addressed the civilians in the chamber. His voice carried authority that cut through the darkness and fear. He told them they were free to leave, that the American outside had promised safe passage, that they should take this chance because he could not offer them another. At first, no one moved. The fear ran too deep, the propaganda too strong. But then, an old woman, always an old woman, Hartley thought,
as if they were the only ones left with the courage to choose life, stood shakily and began walking toward the tunnel. A child followed, then a mother with an infant, and then, like water breaking through a dam, they all began to move. Hartley stood to the side, holding his white flag, as hundreds of people filed past him. Some touched his arm as they passed, a gesture of gratitude or disbelief or simple human connection. Others avoided his eyes, still unable to reconcile the man with the monster they had been taught to fear. Children stared at him with wide eyes. Old men bowed slightly as they passed, acknowledging something that transcended language. It took 3 hours for everyone to leave. 3 hours during which Hartley stood in the chamber with Matsumoto and his soldiers, an impossible tableau of enemies existing in temporary truce. No one spoke. The only sounds were footsteps echoing, the drip of water, the distant murmur of people moving through tunnels toward light.
When the last civilian disappeared, Matsumoto turned to Hartley. Through the interpreter, he said, "You should leave now, Corporal. What happens next is not for American eyes." Hartley understood. He wanted to argue, wanted to convince these men that their lives still had value, that surrender was not dishonor. But he had learned that some beliefs ran too deep to change in a single conversation. He had saved 400 lives today. He would have to live with the knowledge that he couldn't save these 40 soldiers. He bowed again to Matsumoto. The colonel returned the bow, deeper this time, a gesture of respect between warriors who had chosen different paths but recognized something in each other nonetheless. Hartley walked out of the cave. Behind him, he heard Matsumoto giving orders in Japanese. He did not look back. He emerged into rain that had softened to a drizzle, into late afternoon light that seemed impossibly bright after the cave's darkness. Walsh and the others surrounded him immediately, questions flying. But Hartley said nothing until he saw them, the civilians, hundreds of them, sitting in the rain or standing in shocked groups, wrapped in blankets the Marines had distributed, being treated by corpsmen, fed from field kitchens, protected by soldiers they had been taught to fear above all else. "They're out," Hartley said simply. "All of them." From inside the cave came a sound, muffled by limestone and distance, but unmistakable. Gunfire. A single volley, precise and synchronized. Then silence. Matsumoto and his soldiers had chosen their ending. Hartley would carry the weight of that choice along with all the others for the rest of his life, but he would also carry the memory of 400 people walking from darkness into light, choosing life because one man had offered them that choice. The war ended officially on August 15, 1945, with Emperor Hirohito's radio address announcing Japan's surrender. By then, Corporal Daniel Hartley had been recommended for the Navy Cross for his actions on Okinawa. The citation detailed his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty in bringing about the surrender of over 1,500 enemy combatants and civilians through unprecedented methods that saved countless American and Japanese lives. He never received the medal. Bureaucracy, paperwork lost in the chaos of war's end, command changes, the reasons were numerous and ultimately meaningless. Hartley didn't care. He had never done it for recognition. He returned to Oregon in September 1945 aboard a transport ship packed with men who couldn't quite believe they had survived. He stood on deck as the ship approached San Francisco, watching the Golden Gate Bridge emerge from fog, and thought about caves, about darkness and light, about the little girl who had taken his ration and the old woman who had trusted him, and Tanaka who had chosen humanity over hate, and Matsumoto who had chosen death over dishonor. His sister met him at the train station in Portland, running through the crowd to embrace him with a force that nearly knocked him over. She was crying, laughing, holding him like she could keep him safe through sheer will. And for the first time since Okinawa, Hartley felt something break inside him. The careful control he had maintained, the walls he had built to survive each day. He held his sister and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being home, of being alive, of having chosen mercy when he could have chosen anything else. He never talked much about the war. His sister learned not to ask. His students, he became a teacher, like she was, choosing to spend his life building rather than destroying, saw in him a gentleness that seemed unusual for a veteran. Occasionally, one would ask about his service. He would smile and say something vague about serving in the Pacific, and the conversation would drift to other things. But once, in 1967, a student writing a paper on Okinawa asked him directly if he had been there. Hartley was quiet for a long moment, staring out the classroom window at Oregon rain that never quite matched the rain he remembered from that island. "Yes," he finally said. "I was there." "What was it like?" Hartley thought about how to answer, how to compress months of horror and beauty and impossible choices into words a 17-year-old could understand. It was like learning that the hardest thing in war isn't killing, it's choosing not to kill. It's believing that the person in front of you, the enemy, the stranger, the person whose language you don't speak and whose culture you don't understand, that they're still human, that they still matter, that their life still has value even when everything around you is screaming that it doesn't. The student wrote this down, not quite understanding, but sensing something important. "Did you kill anyone?" the student asked, with the thoughtless cruelty of youth. Hartley was quiet again. "Yes," he said, "but that's not what I remember. I remember the ones I didn't kill, the ones I saved. Because at the end of everything, when I'm old and dying and looking back at my life, those are the moments that will matter. Not the deaths, the lives." Daniel Hartley died in 1994, at the age of 72, of heart failure, in the same Oregon town where he had been born. His obituary in the local paper was 3 paragraphs long, mentioning his 40 years of teaching, his service in World War II, his survival by his sister and several nieces and nephews. It said nothing about caves, about Okinawa, about the 1,500 people whose lives he had changed with simple acts of courage and compassion.
But in a small village on Okinawa, in what had once been the valley where Hartley first sat outside a cave offering rations to a terrified child, there stands a memorial. It was erected in 1985 by surviving civilians and their descendants, a simple stone marker with inscriptions in Japanese and English. The English reads, "In memory of those who chose mercy over violence, compassion over hatred, and reminded us that even in war's darkest moments, humanity can prevail. Here, many were saved because one man believed every life mattered." And beneath it, a name, Corporal Daniel Hartley, United States Marine Corps. Every year on August 9th, the anniversary of that first rescue, people gather at the memorial. Survivors, now elderly, speak to their grandchildren about the day the American with the kind eyes sat outside the cave and offered them food instead of death. Children place flowers at the base of the stone. And in the silence between prayers and remembrance, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. The echo of a voice speaking broken Japanese in the darkness, offering not threats, but hope. One man, one choice, 1,500 lives. That was Daniel Hartley's war.
Not the battles he fought, but the people he saved. Not the enemy he killed, but the humanity he protected. And in the end, that became his legacy, a reminder that even in history's darkest chapters, individual choices matter, individual courage counts, and individual compassion can ripple outward in ways we can never fully measure, but always remember. The caves of Okinawa are quiet now, tourist destinations and historical sites. But those who know the stories walk through them differently. They pause at entrances where white flags once waved. They stand in chambers where hundreds huddled in darkness, waiting for death that never came because one Marine corporal decided there had to be a better way. And they remember that the greatest victories are not always measured in territory taken or enemies defeated, but in lives preserved, choices honored, and the simple radical act of seeing the enemy as human. That was Daniel Hartley's gift to the world, not the destruction of war, but the preservation of hope, not the triumph of violence, but the quiet courage of mercy. And in the end, that made all the difference.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.